All right. And once we're clear on our tasks, let's start working on them. And first, what we want to do in the source is to create that context folder. So let's start over here. Let's say new folder, looking for the context. And in there, we'll set up those three files. We'll go with actions.js. Then we'll also set up the reducer. And then I also want to set up my app context. And I believe in the previous video, I didn't show you the import, but in your README, you'll definitely have it, where in the app context, we first want to start by getting the use state, use reducer, as well as use context in order to access the context. So let's start with the app context, where we want to set up our imports. So use state, this is just going to be temporary. Use reducer, which we'll use all throughout the application. And then lastly, we also want to set up the use context, since we want to set up our hook. So let's say here use context. Now all of that is coming from React. And then once I have that in place, then we can set up the import. Now, if you don't want to go with export right here, I also noticed by the end of the video that essentially I'm exporting here the app provider in the object anyway. So if you want, one by one, you can add use app context as well as the initial state. Just don't forget to export them. That's the most important part. So here in the app context, I think I'm going to skip them and I'm just going to add it at the very, very end. So const initial state. Now in here, the values we're looking for is loading. Then I'll set it equal to false. Also, I want to show the alert. So show alert equal to false, and then alert text equal to an empty string. So alert text equal to an empty string, and then alert type also the same thing. Alert, and then type, and that is an empty string as well. Then let's create that context. So in my case, I'm going to call this app context, and we'll set it equal to React, then dot, and then create context. So we created the context. We have two components, the provider as well as the consumer. We're not going to use the consumer, but we do want to set up a new component, app provider. And first we'll be looking for the children, like I mentioned, because we'll render our entire application. That's why it's important. And then as far as the logic, let's just start here with a state, then set state, and that is equal to a use state. And then let's pass in the initial state. So that's our dummy state. Because once we start using use reducer, remember we have dispatch, we have the reducer, and all of that cool stuff. But what we want to focus on is the return. And here we'll go with app context and then dot provider. So that's the component. And in there, there's a value prop where we can set up whatever values we want. And those ones will be passed down to our components. In our case, I'll set it equal to an object and I'll spread out my state values, which essentially is this object over here. So let's go here, dot, 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 and then we'll say state. And then once we set up some functions here, which we will, of course, then we'll add them to this value object. So close it out. And then in here, I want to render my children. Again, I know I said this 20,000 times, but that is our application. The reason why I'm repeating that, because regardless of how many times I repeat that, I still get those questions. So why we use the children? Well, because that is our application, and that's what we're rendering. And then, like I said, we're going to go here with export. And then first I want to export app provider. Then I also want to export initial state. And then we want to set up the hook. Now, why do I want a hook? Well, because if you're not going to have it hooked, then in every component, you'll have to do two things. You'll have to import use context from the React, and you also need to get app context, which is this sucker over here, the context. And only then you'll have access to whatever you have in the value prop. Now, in our case, we want to speed this up. We want to create a custom hook, and that's the reason for this use. You won't be able to use context inside of it unless it starts with use. So we go with use app context, that's the hook, and then we right away return use context and pass in the app context. So the result is going to be following, where I'll get my hook inside of the register, or any other component. And then I'll have access to whatever is in the value. Again, if you took my React course, you already know the drill. But if you're new to this, I'm just explaining kind of the details. So let's set up that hook. And what we're looking for is const, then use app context. So that's the name that I'm going to go with. Then it's going to be a function, and it's simply going to return the use context hook, which is coming from the React, and we'll pass in our app context. And as a result, we'll be able to access our state. So let's say here app context, and then let's scroll down a little bit, and then let's export this sucker as well. So use app and then context. And once we have all of this in place, now what we want to do is go to our main index. So it's not in the components, it's not in the pages. We're talking about the main index over here. And then let's import our provider first. So we're going here with import. Now remember, we need to go with app provider in this case, because we have a few things that we're exporting. And then in here, we're looking in the context, and then more specifically app context. And then we want to wrap our application. So we'll go with app provider. I'm going to close this one. I'll open up another one, and then let's place the app. And the error says that there is no React in the app context. So let me take a look. Yep, I'm going to go back over here, and then I'll add the React one. So we're importing React, then we have the hooks, and then we set up the context. So now let me set this one up in the README. So that way, when you're looking at the README, everything's correct. So let me get this one. And where I have the imports, I'll also add the React one. And once the README is fixed, now we want to go to our page, the register one. And now we want to get the hook. We want to get the use app context hook. This is the case where we can use the nice auto import. Essentially, I'm going to say use app context. It's going to right away import it for me. I will invoke it. And then I want to set it equal to a state, just to showcase that we'll have access to it. So let's say here state, let's save it. So once we navigate to the bigger screen and I refresh and take a look at the console, I should see the object. Now, what is that object? Well, that is my state, correct? So what we can do right now is we can pull out these specific values. And in this case, we are looking for two things. Now, let me double check quickly with a README where essentially I'm looking for is loading and then show alert. So let's go to our register. Where it is, it's over here. And then let's pull out those values. Is loading and then show alert. And then, like I said, we want to remove this one, the local one, and actually switch it to a global one. So now I simply want to remove it from initial state. Then let's keep on scrolling, and then where I have the alert, instead of values, since that property is not there anymore, I'm just using the global one. So once I remove this one, and again, I navigate to the big screen and all that, if I go to components, and if I'm just going to mess with this value a little bit, the show alert one, which you'll notice, is our alert, which is exactly what we're looking for. The difference, however, now, of course, is the fact that we're controlling that from our global context.